The idea of exploring transgender identity in the past is somewhat, it's an incredibly broad one. So I will apologize if this talk is somewhat scattershot. It's been a long time since I've given a talk like this. Um, to give you some sense of where I'm coming from, as Jampa said, I was from 2008 to 2016 a Dornsife Doctoral Fellow in Medieval History at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. My main area of expertise was English monasticism and hagiography, that is, writings about the lives, deaths, and posthumous miracles of saints. My dissertation, Translators and Translations, explored the ways which English monks in the 12th century were rewriting older patron saints to better fit the needs and narratives of their communities in the present moment. So I am acutely aware of the ways in which traditions that are meant to seem timeless are in fact constructed across time. So one of the main reasons I got into history as a field of study and vocation is that I wanted to understand how people in the past ultimately became the people of today. Specifically, I was interested in what people believed then and now. But in academic history, I found out, particularly medieval history, there was an idea in vogue at the time that many held called alterity. And I'm thinking particularly of John Arnold and Marcus Bull as two authors who wrote books on the subject. Effectively, they like to argue in professional history that there is an inherent otherness in the past, and that people there cannot and should not be read through today's lenses. In a way, they are alien to us. Alterity tends to dominate the professional field of history. Now, you can hopefully see how such a view would make it difficult for us to go looking for queerness or transgender identities in the past. If the people in the past are simply different than we are in some way that we can never understand, surely we cannot project our experiences back. Well, thankfully for me and our inquiry today, my advisor, Lisa Patel, was one of the historians who spoke out against alterity. In her research, she felt perfectly comfortable ascribing anti-Semitism to the people of medieval England when they were being, in a word, anti-Semitic. We can use, she argued, the values of today to understand and in some cases hold the past up for judgment. This is fortunate, as the lens that we call transgender only appeared in print in 1974, 5 years after Marsha Johnson was throwing bricks at the Stonewall riot. So I think we can all agree that there were people we might describe as transgender further back than that 1974 date. So what might that have looked like? One thing that I struggled with as first, and I think we should keep in mind, is that the pre-modern world wasn't dominated by purely two sexes as we would understand them. Castrated males, eunuchs, were a part of society from ancient times. The author of the Gospel of Matthew has Jesus telling his disciples that not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, there are eunuchs who have been made by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. That's Matthew 19, verses 12 through 14. Now, Jesus is pretty clearly talking about sexual continence in marriage and divorce in this passage. But usually if Jesus says something obtuse, his disciples will ask about it. And here the author simply moves on. The Matthew writer understands that part of this world is eunuchs and how they came to be, and the audience would know that as well. I'm going to jump a little bit chronologically here, in fact, quite a bit. I was thinking about this talk after Jampa had invited me, about how eunuchs might have been understood to fit in society, when one evening I picked up my complete Shakespeare to read Twelfth Night. Imagine my surprise then, in Act 1, Scene 2, Viola, seeking employment in Duke Orsino's court, asks her sea captain to pass her off as a eunuch. What this means and what this tells us, this plot conceit could not have worked for a late 16th century English audience if they didn't know what a eunuch was. They would have to understand what a eunuch was and have it make sense that a eunuch might be employed in the court of an Italian duke. Moreover, they would have to know that a eunuch and a woman might have been similar enough in appearance that one could pass for the other in order for this plot device to make sense. This becomes even more interesting when we remember that the actor playing Viola would have been a man playing a woman playing a eunuch. Eunuchs were far less common in England than in the Mediterranean, but they had to have been common enough knowledge for this play to have worked for an English audience. I say eunuchs were more common in the Mediterranean because of the lasting Islamic influence across the region. Eunuchs lived effectively as their own third gender in Islamic courts throughout the Middle Ages. It was understood in the Central Middle Ages, around the turn of the millennium, that Greek monasteries that were Eastern Orthodox castrated boys in order to preserve their singing voices. Muslim pirates periodically raided these monasteries to help supply eunuchs to the Muslim world. There was literally an economy trading in castrated boys. So there's this third option out there, the eunuch, that we should understand existed differently and outside the gender binary. But what about men who are living within the gender binary but were different? I think about there's an author working in Paris in the 13th century named Peter Abelard, who shows us what castration looks like in the case of a person who considers themselves a man. His house was broken into, and he was castrated and emasculated by servants of the local duke, whose niece Heloise had been his student, whom he had seduced. So in response for this seduction, he was castrated. He considered himself ruined. He considered himself damaged. He considered himself, problematic at that point. But there are other outcomes in the case of sexual difference, including not just castration, but simply impotence. I have an example I'd like to share with you from Gregory, the Bishop of Tours in France, who wrote 10 books of history in the late 6th century. So these are the late 500s AD, CE. This particular account comes as a Frankish noblewoman, Clotilde. She was a princess, and she was put in a nunnery. And she did not like being in the nunnery and effectively overthrew the abbess. So this particular account, let's see. This is in Poitiers in France. And so the nobles assembled to try and figure out the situation. And here I'm reading directly from Gregory's 10 books. Then we, the bishops, that's Gregory, we, took our seats on the tribunal of the cathedral. Clotilde, the rebellious nun, was called before us. She showered abuse on her abbess and made a number of accusations against her. She maintained that the abbess kept a man in the nunnery, dressed in women's clothing, and looking like a woman, who, although in effect there was no doubt that he was a man, his job was to sleep with the abbess whenever she wanted. Why, there's the fellow, Clotilde cried, pointing with her finger. Thereupon the man stepped forward, dressed in women's clothing, as I have told you. Everyone stared at him. He said that he was impotent, and that was the reason why he dressed himself up in this way. He maintained that he had never set eyes on the abbess, although of course he knew her by name. He had never spoken to her in his life, and that in any case he lived more than 40 miles outside of Poitiers. Clotilde failed to prove her abbess guilty on this count. So here we have an assembly of the nobles and the bishops. These are the men who dictate canon law, who dictate the law of the land. See this man dressed as a woman and say, yeah, that's no problem. She doesn't appear in, the person doesn't appear in the text anymore beyond this point. It is simply, and Clotilde's accusations that this man was, with the abbess fall flat. And Gregory moves on. I'm not quite sure what to make of this text, other than it certainly didn't seem to bother the bishop that there was a man living in women's dress. And this is the late 600s. I'd like to turn a little bit closer to my own research in the hagiographical literature of the Central Middle Ages. In writing the lives of saints, authors frequently wanted to build up their patron saint as much as possible. In the case of female saints, there's a particular trope I find interesting in the context of thinking about transgender identities. Male authors frequently described female saints, and I'm thinking particularly of Concubranus, a 10th century Irish author's Life of Monina, as having the spirit of a man in a female body. Usually this came with masculine attributes, such as building communities or navigating the political landscape of the period. These women were described as having a manly spirit which possessed them, and in some ways allowed them to transcend the traditional gender hierarchy. In this context, I should also point out that monks and nuns also exist outside the traditional gender hierarchy, which was built largely around sexual roles. They were understood to be masculine and feminine. In Latin, they were either monachus or monaca, but their existence as chaste members of the social order set them apart from the sexualized hierarchy of the day. In the late 11th century, when chastity is being forced onto priests, they too start to exist outside of the gender hierarchy of the day. So there are places where there is slippage between, male masculine, female feminine across the Middle Ages. I'd like to turn now to two examples from the New World. The first of these is among the natives, particularly the natives who lived in the lower Mississippi Valley, with whom French missionaries and traders made contact at the turn of the 18th century. You see, the tribes that these Frenchmen encountered had a cultural practice of a third gender. They had a gendered division of labor in their society, but some of the women's work was being done by men who lived as women. And there were men who were marrying these third gendered men and basically building a same-sex household. The French referred to these natives as berdashes, borrowing really an old Arabic word for eunuchs, and we come kind of full circle here. Berdashes lived as women, worked as women, and married men. The Catholic missionaries considered the practice scandalous and sought to eradicate it across the territory. I should also mention, out on the plains, central, what is now the central United States, there were also more genders than simply two. They had split their labor. There was a division of labor, sort of homework that was feminine, and hunting, which was masculine. But it didn't necessarily pertain feminine to female sex. There were masculine men, there were masculine people. I got to get this right because it's confusing. There were male people who worked the feminine gender roles, and there were same-sex households that were male-male and female-female that still had that division of labor. So it's fair to say, and I just want to say at this point, that there were transgender individuals living across North America before the Europeans arrived. The final example I'd like to turn to is the case. I actually don't know what to call this person, so I'm going to call them by their surname, Hall. In 1629, the gender identity of servant Thomas Hall stirred controversy among the residents of Warasquyoak, which I think I'm saying that, I'm butchering it, I'm sure, but it's a Native American plantation. It's across the river from Jamestown. A servant's man reported that Hall had lain with a maid of Mr. Richard Bennett's. So servants and maids hooking up in the colony was not unheard of. But fornication wasn't an unheard of charge. But Hall's situation soon spiraled until it ended up going to the General Court of Jamestown. In those court records, Hall testified that they had worn women's clothing and performed traditionally female tasks such as needlework. They were christened, baptized Thomasine, and had grown up a girl. They had also worn male clothing and worked as an apprentice. They had also worn female clothing and worked as a prostitute. Now, whatever their plumbing might have been, this had to tell us that a man in Elizabethan England would have patronized a prostitute regardless of their biological sex. Now, Thomasine Hall became a man to travel to Virginia, but occasionally donned female garb, which confused neighbors, masters, and plantation captains. When asked by Captain Nathaniel Basque, Warasquyoak's most prominent resident, whether he was a man or a woman, Hall replied that they were both. Now, this was transgressive in the Society of English Virginia, or perhaps it wasn't. For the local Warasquyoak locals sent Hall's case, as I said, to the General Court at Jamestown, yielding testimony that we can see. Hall describes their own body. Let's see. Hall, there's two different sort of systems at play here. One is the gender system of what clothing you're wearing and thus how you fit in society. And the head of the court at Jamestown is a Galenic doctor. So there's an idea of sexual difference, wherein men are complete and perfect and women are incomplete men. But there is sort of somewhat of a spectrum spectrum there. Now, in cases of what they were calling at the time, or what the author of this article was calling hermaphroditism, what we would understand today as intersex people, they were expected to adopt one gender identity or the other. Now, Hall is transgressive because Hall is refusing to do this. Let's see. We would probably, given the examination, Hall was examined by a board of married women, who is what the court would call on to identify or to examine a woman's body. Hall was also examined by men of the court. Hall also described their own situation to the court. By today's standards, I think we would call them intersex. But what was interesting is they were punished. Hall was punished by being forced to permanently adopt a male identity and to wear breeches and a shirt. But Hall was also enforced by the court to wear a woman's bonnet and a woman's apron. The court effectively created a new gender category for Hall and put them in it. The court never actually addressed Hall's culpability for fornication. So, in sum, gender, as we know, is a construct, and all the ways that genders have been constructed in every time and place, and behave differently in every time or place. I personally believe that there are many more examples of gender fluidity and transgender identity waiting to be explored in the archives. There hasn't been a ton of work done on this subject. In fact, when I searched for transgender in the Middle Ages, most of the examples of most of the scholarship came from one volume on transgender identity in saints' lives, and I can give you the citation for that if you like. So there is much more, there's a little bit, this is the Spencer and Gutt book, but I think that there's a ton more work for historians to do. But what I think we can say with some degree of certainty is that transgender identity is not new and has been here the entire time. That our forebears, so let's see, but I think there's much more to be understood about the varied ways that our forebears conceived gender and sexual difference and identity. Thank you.